From the cold vastness of space, our small planet may look pristine, but it is fragile and in peril. The Earth's global temperature is becoming more and more erratic and is rising to record highs. Some areas on Earth are more sensitive to a warming climate, and one is a giant island covered by ice, high on the Arctic Circle, Greenland. A very remote and complex Arctic environment between North America and Europe holds one of the world's greatest amounts of freshwater ice, second only to Antarctica. While all glaciers and ice sheets are essential to the survival of Earth's current climate, studying the science of Greenland holds one of the keys to better understand how humans impact this reserve of ice and how it can be better protected in the future. Join us on an exciting expedition to the Arctic isolation of Greenland, led by Dr. Perry Sampson. The team he has selected is a hand-picked group of adventurous and brilliant undergraduate students, 3 expert professors from the fields of solar, climate, and glacial science, and a wayward filmmaker trying to find his place on this adventure. As they prepare for the voyage of a lifetime, unlike anything they have done before, they soon realize this will not be an easy trip. In part 1, we meet the team, learn about the history of this special island of ice, how this expedition was dreamt up, and how it became a reality. Welcome to the new North Pole of the Winds.
My name is Perry Sampson. I'm a professor in the Department of Climate and Space Sciences and Engineering at the University of Michigan. Global temperatures are rising, and few would debate that. And as it happens, as global temperatures rise, it's not rising equally everywhere. The Arctic temperatures are rising faster than outside the Arctic, and Greenland is sort of the canary in the cage. They have a lot of ice that's located on land, unlike the ice in the Arctic Ocean, which melts. But when you start melting ice on land, it adds extra volume to the ocean, so it adds the sea level rise in a dramatic way.
Through my work at the Center for Academic Innovation, I've worked with Perry for a number of years, and he was always mentioning this expedition that he was about to propose to the National Science Foundation. It involved undergraduate students riding around in a C-130 with skis. It just sounded amazing.
We're at a point where we need more climate scientists, so give students the opportunity to get their hands dirty. One of our fundamental attempts in this was to bring in more students who are first-generation students who haven't had much opportunity to get out and travel, so that they could begin to get a sense for what this classroom material means when you're actually doing it.
You see the black dots on top?
I'm Mackenzie Zowell. I'm a senior here at the University of Michigan studying environmental engineering. When I was a little girl, my dream job for when I was older was to be an expedition leader. So when I saw the opportunity to go to Greenland on an expedition, my heart just kind of stopped. I was so excited, and I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to learn more about climate science, because that's something that I didn't really learn a lot about with my environmental engineering degree. So it was just another opportunity to learn more and to become more involved in the climate crisis.
So I am Mark. I am a senior here at the University of Michigan. I study aerospace engineering, so not necessarily directly climate related, but I was very excited to have an opportunity to start conducting some real life field research, as well as something that I'm fairly passionate about, which is the environment and how important that is. which is usually kind of odd coming from an aerospace engineer. We're normally focused on other planets and not necessarily our own, but of course, to get somewhere, we have to start from somewhere, so we need ours.
My name is Abby Meyer. I'm a computer science student. I wanted to go on the expedition because it was an expedition to Greenland, and I've always wanted to participate in environmental fieldwork, so this was an amazing opportunity to try my hand at fieldwork in the most amazing place, I think, in the world.
My name is Lydia. I'm currently a sophomore. I wanted to go because when else do you get a chance to go to Greenland and to get your hands in field research as a freshman? It doesn't happen. Now that I've been to the Arctic, I am definitely coming back.
We had an extraordinary group of students from the University of Michigan. Alec, Abby, Mark, Amaro, Lydia, Mackenzie, and Cheyenne. From the University of Albany, Allie, Celia, and Chelsea. From Virginia Tech, Ian, Gwyneth, and Celeste. Our faculty leads were Dr. Perry Sampson, Dr. Jeremy Bassis, Dr. Mark Flanner, and Dr. Bob Clower. This was our full team, and we were ready to go.
My name is Jeremy Bassis, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Climate and Space Sciences, and I study how ice sheets and glaciers change in response to past, present, and future climate change. The University of Michigan has a historical presence in some of the original field campaigns to look at some geology and atmospheric conditions in Greenland.
They did sort of some of the first long-term meteorological recordings in Greenland.
So they left on a boat called the Morrissey, and it took them about 3 weeks to get there.
They were battered by storms throughout. And then when they got there, they had to set up camp. One of their ships sank, their primitive equipment broke down.
2 years they left somebody recording temperature pressure through a couple winters.
It's really inspiring to see how much science they got out of their expedition without the technology that we've been given today.
They also ventured out in the ice sheet a little bit. They were the ones who were using the theodolite and releasing weather balloons because that was what they had at the time.
Out of that multi-year expedition came some of the first results about the climate of Greenland, but also a book detailing the exploits of their adventure called The North Pole of the Winds.
Before we went on this trip, we read The North Pole of the Winds, which was written by Professor Hobbs.
I think the book gave an interesting framework to see the research we were doing now in.
I could also tell that it was very dated in comparison to now.
If we go back to the original 1926 campaign, it was all men, all white men, and all professors. And we want a more diverse cohort to be interested in polar science, to women, to underrepresented minorities, to people that maybe didn't really consider a career in polar sciences. And the way to get people to interested is to take them to this spectacular landscape and show them what it looks like, to show people how dramatic it is and how dramatic it's changing.
Here in the second chapter, our recently chosen team sets off to the state of New York, to the campus of the University at Albany, to prepare for the adventure of a lifetime. As they pack, they learn more about each other and how their experiments will fit into a larger picture of what is happening high in the Northern Hemisphere, to a place few visit and even fewer understand. Join us now for part 2 of the new North Pole of the Winds.
Most of the students found out a few months before the expedition that they were going to be on it.
There was also one late addition to our program because we had one student drop out, and that was Homero.
Oh, Homero, yes. Well, Homero is a special case because he came to the department from Monterrey, Mexico, and he was going to work with me on issues of air quality related to Monterrey. So we had an extra slot, and I invited him to go with us. And on top of that, we didn't have an airplane ticket, so he drove.
Homero and I borrowed Perry's Prius, filled it with expedition gear and our experiments, and drove from Michigan to New York. Hey, buddy. Where are we?
New York still. Another 4 hours.
Oh, get ready for another 6.
The first 24 hours of the expedition were a lot of travel. So I went from Ann Arbor and took a plane to Albany, where I got picked up from the airport, and then
We stayed at the University of Albany in some of their dorms.
People were coming from 3 different institutions. Most people didn't know each other, so part of that was just team building.
We were sort of getting to know each other, sort of going over the schedule.
we all had a little meeting and had a little pizza. That was pretty fun. We were all split into groups to figure out what our experiments were going to be.
We had the weather balloon group, the stream flow meter group, the air quality group, the solar radiation group, and the drone group.
Perry gave us all of the equipment, but then we had to figure out what to do with it.
A lot of us hadn't used that sort of instrumentation, especially in the field, so we wanted to test it first in Albany and make sure that everyone was really comfortable with what we would be working with.
Because once you're out in the field, if you're missing critical components of your equipment, your battery doesn't work, you didn't bring the right wrench, you can't set things up. So you always practice in advance, so we know exactly what we're doing when it's going to be much more difficult.
For example, we launched a few balloons to make sure we knew how to do it and that setup would be easy and that we would have all the pieces when we flew it to Greenland.
I was in charge of the drone team. While it was pretty rainy on Albany's campus, we still needed to prepare. Thankfully, we were able to get some permission to fly around in the underground tunnels.
Flying the drones inside was also kind of crazy, really fun. I remember one crashing and everybody being really afraid of it at that point.
We also flew the drone in the University of Albany's drone lab, where they put us through an obstacle course so we could get comfortable with handling the drones.
So I had a small device called a flow meter. It would basically output the pressure from the bottom of the stream that we put it in. So I got to use my fluid mechanics class that I had taken last year. Fun time.
We actually put it in some fountains and then in little streams that ran through the campus. A few team members built the solar radiation instrumentation in Albany as well.
They also not only had to build out part of the hardware, they also had to code some of the software.
Also, we did balloon measurements, and back in the 1920s, they made measurements using pie balls, they call them, pilot balloons, and theodolites, which are basically little telescopes, with the challenge that you have to physically follow the balloon with the telescope.
So you're looking for the balloon as it goes up, and you're using this theodolite to track it, so you can read those things off as the balloon is going up, and from those angles you can get a wind profile of the atmosphere.
So each experiment had their own challenges, and so it made it really obvious how much we needed that prep time in Albany.
So the morning before we departed for Greenland, we were staying in a hotel.
Lydia and I were sharing a hotel room. We kind of just laid there and talked about what we were most excited for.
Yeah, I was just really excited, and it was all new, so, it's gonna be an adventure.
So we got up in the morning, we went downstairs, and we were sitting there waiting for everybody to be ready.
So the morning we were going to leave, we were being picked up by the 109th Air Wing of the Air National Guard. And I was terrified that someone would sleep in and we would miss them. So I kept on counting heads and making sure that everyone was there.
And then a giant blue bus pulls up in front of the hotel.
And of course, we had a few stragglers that showed up at just the right moment to get on the bus.
And some Air Force guys walk in and they're like, ready to go to Greenland? And we all just kind of look at each other like, yeah, we're ready to go to Greenland.
So they checked our passports, and then we were off to Stratton Air Force Base.
Everyone at the base was very friendly, but it also had an air of very serious, and you were not supposed to be doing anything out of line or out of step.
I can't confirm this, but I think this was one of the very first times most of the team had been at a military base, so there were a lot of wide-eyed moments.
I remember them just tossing our bags into this huge luggage container, which then we found out was just going to be strapped right next to us on the plane.
In general, whenever you're doing anything related to polar studies, Arctic or Antarctic, you hurry up and then you sit and you wait until something happens.
So we just sat there waiting, and then all of a sudden it was time to go to Greenland.
But I was really excited to see all the students' faces when we actually got out onto the runway, when they actually saw the plane that we were going to get on, seeing the aircraft, and kind of thinking about that it's actually going to be real.
And everybody was taking pictures and looking so excited. We finally got in and we just sat down in those red netted seats, and that was that.
A C-130 is a plane that no one should ever fly in.
The C-130 is a beast of an airplane. It was originally designed during the Cold War in the 1950s, and it was designed so large that it could hold trucks or drop jeeps and tanks out the cargo door.
It can carry a lot of material, but it's not meant for people.
The seats were a bit dodgy in that they were just cargo netting that you folded yourself into.
Everybody was all squished in together, which was fun. It was definitely a bonding moment for us all.
The interior is a fairly utilitarian environment. Exposed ductwork throughout, wires going every which way.
It's extremely loud, full of vibrations.
As one of the pilots put it on, it's like riding a bumblebee. Very loud, large bumblebee.
Wound up landing first in Newfoundland to refuel on the way because the plane was very heavy and it needed extra fuel.
The flight crew is a safety-conscious group, so we disembarked as they refueled. We went in the small airport and hung tight for about 20 minutes. And then we heard, "All right, head back out."
Got to stand up, walk around, go to the cockpit. You could see where we were flying. You could go all the way to the back. In fact, at one point, 2 other flyers took out their sleeping bags, climbed on top of all the luggage, and slept for 7 hours. So if I ever go back, I'm definitely gonna take a note out of their book.
Through almost 70 years of service, you're guaranteed one thing with the C-130. You'll always get where you're wanting to go.
Join us for the third part of our adventure, where our team has just set off for Greenland and are starting to learn about what is in store for them on this intrepid journey. Welcome to Greenland, the new North Pole of the winds.
here.
Kangerlussuaq is an interesting town.
Kangerlussuaq is a town of about 500 people, and it revolves completely around the airport.
The community is supported by the airport because it used to be a U.S. Air Force station, which is also one of the reasons why we get to fly in through there.
But that didn't take away from it being absolutely breathtaking.
So I would describe Kangerlussuaq as very beautiful, very wide open.
I had always seen the Arctic as barren, which in some cases it is in terms of not having anything past like that high on the ground. But it has this subtle beauty to it that really struck me. In Kangerlussuaq, we stayed at the Kangerlussuaq International Science Support Station.
And in science circles around Greenland, the dorms had another name, KISS.
And that's where all of the scientists that are working through the NSF programs end up staying before they leave for the deep field, or if they're doing research that's within driving or hiking distance.
It feels a bit like you're on a ship because it was also very narrow, but in terms of dorm rooms, they're not actually that bad.
After we were settled at KISS, we went over to the warehouse to get prepared to go into the field.
They have a very well-equipped facility there to support the scientists, and also to provide any provisions, to provide the tents, the sleeping bags, the ropes, all sorts of other things you might need as part of your research. They have little pickup trucks there that we were allowed to use, and the pickup trucks are very rugged because you can pack all your stuff in the back, and we were able to take about 4 of them into the field.
The first few days at KISS were a lot of fun. We rebuilt all of our experiments, tested out everything, charged up batteries, but we did have one very important thing left to figure out.
Camping in Greenland was somewhat nerve-wracking, and it became that way from even a month before we went, when the National Science Foundation called and said, look, how good are you with a gun? It turns out that they were having an issue with polar bears, and they wanted us to be aware of that and be armed if necessary to protect ourselves. We decided the better plan was every student take bear spray. And so we went through training about how to use bear spray, how to spray it, and give you an opportunity to get away from the bear. We decided to use some netting that they had to put around the campsite, and this netting has a voltage like 15,000 volts, which would deter any bears from wanting to come into the camp.
After all the planning and packing at KISS, we set off for the warehouse to pick up some empty coolers. And then we went to the local market to buy provisions for us 18 people for when we were out in the backcountry. That's a lot of stuff.
There's like 45 eggs under that rice.
We then followed the NSF team down the long and winding road out of Kangerlussuaq towards the ice sheet, to a place that they suggested would be perfect for our base camp. And they were right. It was absolutely perfect. Most of us had never been in a place quite like this.
We could see glaciers off in the distance. There was a lake fed by glacial runoff not too far from camp. It was an experience for everyone. Some of the students had never camped before, so this is a whole new experience. Just imagine your first time camping was in Greenland.
It's a base camp, sort of had like a center tent with our sort of individual tents around it, surrounded by the good old electric fence. And it was sort of pushed up against this big hill where if you climbed it, you could see 4 different glaciers coming from 4 different directions, which was really cool.
So we had our little compound where we slept and cooked and had our community meetings, and that was right next to the river, which was beautiful.
As we were setting up base camp, we noticed right underneath it was something that looked like hiking trails. So we asked the NSF team where those led, and they told us those weren't made by humans. Those are caribou migration trails. Not many people had been here, and it looked like it.
All right, we've had a change of plans. Because it's sunny outside and because Colleen has just taken me down the road and the road, surprisingly, is open, we're going to the ice. We're going to go hiking on the ice and we're going to take the drones and start flying. Not many people have had the opportunity to walk on the glacier, and unfortunately that opportunity is probably going to be less and less in the future. So to walk on this glacier was somewhat magical. First of all, just to get to it was just great luck.
In fact, when we first landed, they broke the hard news that one of the bridges was probably going to be flooded out and we couldn't get to the glacier at all.
The flow coming out of the glacier was so strong that we couldn't drive our trucks. They receded and we were able to drive to the spot near the ice sheet and then hike over the moraine.
Walking on the glacier was tricky.
It's not flat. There was almost waves made out of ice that you were walking between. It was like being on a frozen ocean.
So being able to see this bright blue weaving through the ice and being able to look at the physicality of the ice and hear the ice sheet moving in different parts was so cool.
It's just a teeny tiny glacier in Greenland, and yet how massive it is on kind of a human scale.
Our team is out in the wilderness and has run into some trouble. The weather isn't cooperating, experiments are failing, and time is running out. Even though things may not be working as planned, spirits are high and exploration of this new place continues. Welcome to the fourth part of the new North Pole of the Winds.
So because we were at fairly high latitudes, the sun was up in the sky all day and all night, and it never got dark.
The midnight sun was never something that I expected I would see, but after I saw it, I was like, wow, this is one of the coolest things I've seen in my life.
It was really quite disorienting being out there with the sun around us 24/7.
It was a little weird the first night because we were out hiking until about midnight.
You have to wear sunscreen because the sun's out the whole day that you're outside, which is just so cool. What an amazing part of the world.
And it's very obvious to me how, like, back in the old book with Hobbes talking about his experiments, how they would just get up at 1 4:30 in the morning and start doing things because everybody was awake and they had the daylight to do that. It almost felt like that was something that we should have been doing, just throw clocks to the wind and do things when we wanted to do them.
I feel like whenever I'm camping here, it's always kind of scary to get up and go to the bathroom at night, but there it was nice, even though there could have been polar bears. I think that was my main concern for getting up in the middle of the night.
I like to cook. I like to eat, therefore I like to cook. The first night I volunteered to make a spaghetti dish.
Well, making food for that many people is always tricky.
I could not get the water to boil for the pasta, so I wrapped my jacket around the pot, and unfortunately got too close to the flames, and so the jacket was on fire, and I had to stomp that out. And I don't think anybody ever noticed that there were parts of jacket in the sauce, but it was still fairly tasty, I thought.
Well, I'm definitely not a picky eater, so I wasn't like turning my nose up at anything.
They were actually pretty good.
Everything's worth it for a good pot of pasta.
We were supposed to get about 1/4 of an inch of rain over the course of those 48 hours, and instead we got a lot more.
But that didn't deter a group of us from going on a pretty epic morning hike.
It was amazing to be able to see from a higher vantage point that wasn't an airplane flying in, seeing the expanse of the ice sheet in front of us and how astonishingly big this island is. Whenever we found something new, I was seeing it for the first time. I'd never seen an Arctic hare before. Finding a little bit of the fur was really exciting. I'd never seen a caribou before, and seeing the caribou and then finding an antler was amazing.
While we were rejuvenated by that hike, we returned back down to base camp to a group ready to go somewhere. We didn't know where, but they certainly did. We were off to our first calving front.
That moment where you walk up to the edge of this ice sheet is extremely emotional. It's literally a wall of ice that's probably like 10 stories high. And standing in front of that, you feel small, first of all, but you also feel just so blessed to have this opportunity to stand here.
It was picture perfect. It was blue. There were just millions of different tones within the ice itself. Some of it was brown, some of it was just bright white. Just the immensity of it all was really, really interesting. You're like, oh, now I understand why the ice sheet has such a big impact on everything else in the world, because it's huge. It's huge. And it was so fun to be able to hike with everybody, and we're flying the drones around, we're taking different measurements, we're having fun, we're telling stories all in front of this thing that has centered us all.
Oh, hello.
Hi.
It's a bit cold, but that's what you get when you're next to a glacier.
Seeing the calving front was like, this is it. This is the experience for us. Like, that really felt like it was kind of the pinnacle of the trip for me.
After another lovely dinner, this one with a little less jacket in the sauce, we all squished into the big tent and talked about what we had just experienced.
We were like one cohesive unit. Like we were almost getting to like a family of sorts. So we were sitting there just trying to stay warm out of the rain, all eating dinner, and then all of a sudden Allie started coming up with these absolutely atrocious mind games that she was subjecting us all to.
Johnny, 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 whoop, Johnny, whoop, Johnny, 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 Johnny.
All right, I'm leaving. No, I mean Greenland.
And so all of us were trying to guess it and figure it out, and we were all divided. I remember Bob being in complete arms about it. And so it was a really interesting way in watching the conversation go from like, oh, these fun mind games and whimsical, to a little more serious, like, oh, what are we trying to do? What's important to us? And then kind of come back out of that, back into being like lighthearted and fun. We sat in there for quite a few hours just enjoying each other's company. It was very nice.
As we all chatted, Lydia, Abby, and Alec were all talking about the epic morning hike that we had gone on, and it now looked like there was a second group that wanted to follow in their footsteps.
And so we went out behind the base camp, hopped over the river, climbed up ridges, and there was a lot of like loose rock. And so we were just like kind of trying to climb across it, and then every step that you would take, like these rocks would be tumbling down these ridges, and then eventually they'd hit the like lake.
When we reached the top of the first moraine, we turned around and saw these tiny little dots off in the distance, and we realized that our group was about to get a little bigger.
And we have this gorgeous view of the glacier in the background. Or Gwyneth. We got a couple men down here, just so tiny back there. So tiny.
The evening hike that we went on is something that I think about a lot. I remember being really intimidated by the giant hill because I just had to lift my legs up super high for them to get above the moss and be able to take a step up. We crossed the river and we went to where the edge of the ice sheet was, and it dropped off into a really beautiful lake. And we walked as close to the ice sheet as we could to be safe, and then we kind of backed off and walked up that giant mountain that was right next to base camp, which was incredible because at the top we got to look out and see the cliff of ice that was leading down into the water and base camp, and you just got an incredible view of the ice sheet. So I feel like that was one of the best lookout spots on the entire trip.
After a nice hike, you like to get a little midnight snack, and so we decided to raid those coolers.
So we walked down to the truck, did a quick look around, nobody was looking, so we opened those coolers, and guess what we got out of it? Cheese. So we all had a little midnight cheese snack after our hike together.
I'm pretty sure Perry was a little bit upset with us because we were taking away ingredients from his following meals that he was going to make for us, but at the time it was definitely worth it. We needed that.
I think what stuck with me was truly how remote this place was and how not many people from outside of Greenland had ever stood there. In the news, you see that the general public doesn't know that Greenland is inhabited at all. I think it's hard to care about a place if you haven't seen it or laid eyes on it, and the Arctic is seen like that, where it's seen as barren, but we don't think about the grand scale of how beautiful it is and how necessary it is for life and how it needs to be protected for both the whole earthly ecosystem as well as for the people that live there and are surviving there and have been there for thousands of years.
Join our expedition as the team embarks on a brief mission to the remote science outpost in the middle of Greenland's ice sheet, Summit Station. What will be found as our team explores a place few get to visit in one of the coldest places on Earth? Find out in Part 5 of The New North Pole of the Winds.
The phrase went around that field science is a contact sport.
In science, if you're not failing, you're not trying hard enough. When you go into the field, you have to think and advance carefully about all the things that can go wrong. Despite all our best efforts, sometimes the experiments fail. And that is precisely what science is you are gonna fall down a lot.
We got scraped up, equipment got destroyed, we left people behind, we got lost.
The science part is you learn from that. Take what you've learned and say, all right, next time, here's what I do differently. And document that so others wouldn't make that same mistake. So you shouldn't be fearful of taking chances. You should only be fearful of not trying hard enough.
The edge of base camp performing the radio sound experiment, that felt very like, yes, we are doing something technical. We are sending up this instrument, we are collecting like a vertical profile of the atmosphere. That's very exciting. And then it was a lot more fun and kind of whimsical to try and do like the old style method of using the pieball and the theodolite, because it was effectively like, oh, we're launching a balloon and we're going to see if we can track it, and somehow we're going to figure out like wind speed and direction from that. So it was super neat, especially with how skillful Sean was at maneuvering these drones. We'd be launching these balloons, and our first thought was, I swear, if Sean pops that with those blades, we're going to be furious. But it was amazing to see like our balloon actually being launched and then have the drone kind of circling around it to show like what that kind of altitude looks like, and as we started to rise up and collect the data that we needed to. So it was a really neat blend of like how the different experiments were kind of coming together.
Our camping experience in Greenland had come to a close. It was time to pack everything up back in the trucks and head back to Kagerlussuaq. However, on the way, we had a stop to make.
Good morning. Good morning. It is Sunday and we have survived the majority of this trip. We're just now sitting here eating breakfast, and we're gonna pack our tents up and we're gonna head back, and halfway back we're gonna stop at a glacier.
Coming up to Wrestler, you do this big hike sort of up to the top, and then you look down and you see this sheet of ice sort of going up over another ridge. You don't really get the scale of it, not yet anyway. You get to the rocks, and now you're starting to get a bit of this scale of this calving face. And the size of the glacier struck me like no other we'd ever visited.
Like a skyscraper that we were standing next to, all ice that is going to be falling off soon. It's just hard to picture the amount of water that's held there and the amount of fresh water that's all in reserves there. We had set up our stream flow device right downstream of the calving front, and when we had set it up, there was about 1.5 feet of water in the spot that it was in.
It was just so tall and beautiful, and I was just sort of like, I need to get closer to this thing. So I sort of just scrambled along the rocks. Probably got a little bit too close. Sorry, Jeremy. Though it probably wouldn't have been good where I was to be when a piece fell off. I stopped at one point, and I sort of just turned my ear toward the glacier. You just heard this deep sort of rumbling and cracking. This is such a huge structure. It's also, in my mind, it sort of also was permanent. I guess the second time we went back, I sort of realized my contradiction a bit more, because
we noticed that a huge chunk of ice had fallen.
A large section had fallen flat into the river and obstructed about 2/3 of it, and then sort of off to the side, another half moon bay had sort of caved in.
When we went to check the stream flow monitor, all the water was gone from that spot. There was no water there at all.
This was submerged up to here at least, and we don't have any water. Which should make for a very interesting data analysis on our part.
This glacier is falling apart. It's so beautiful and amazing, and it seems so permanent, but how does it break like that?
We don't know what happened, obviously. It was a bummer in that we didn't have the data that we wanted to have. It's interesting data that we're still trying to parse through and figure out.
That spot right there is probably where I fell in love with glaciology.
They brought us out to the warehouse where they had us completely get ready for Summit Station. Being up there, you have to be prepared for like -10, 20 degrees.
Getting all the garb was almost worrying because I thought I might freeze.
And so they had us completely outfitted in like full parkas, fresh boots.
I felt like I could have been, I don't know, in outer space and been warm. It almost hypes you up for what this place is gonna be like.
I'm a relatively small person, so all of the equipment was kind of huge on me. I got a huge red coat by the North Face, and I just felt like a little bean up in my coat.
It's a place so few people have been able to get to in the middle of nowhere, the North Pole of the Winds. it gets you excited to experience something that you've never experienced. And you know you've never experienced it because you've never been so bundled up before.
Okay, we're going to Summit. It's time. The thing we've all been waiting for. We're going to Summit. And I was really excited about it, but I also had this weird feeling. I was like, is this really happening right now? Am I really going to stand on 10,500 feet of ice?
I got to see some very cool superglacial lakes, which are lakes on top of the ice. But the lakes were just so blue.
The blues of the meltwater against the snow and ice were just a photographer's dream.
I can see why they call that color glacier blue. It really is.
Landing at Summit Station in the Ski Bird is an extraordinary experience. First of all, you're in a plane that has skis on it, and you're landing on a runway made of ice and snow that's 15,000 feet long. There's no such thing as hitting the brakes on a runway made of ice. And it's so cold there, they can't turn the engines off. So they just leave them running the entire time you're there.
If we got off the plane, you're half blind, and so you're just sort of stumbling around and falling.
Everything was white. Everything was almost foggy and windy.
Looking around, and I just felt like I was, in the middle of a snow globe. I felt kind of like I had been shaken around.
But yet when you went inside a building, it felt like you were going into a ski lodge.
It's just, you look around and there's the white of the ice sheet, and then there's the slight gray of the clouds.
It is a cold and brutal environment, and it's not one for exposed electronics. It actually killed my camera and gimbal while I was there.
We were talking to some of the cooks, learning about everybody's story, what brought them there. It was so interesting to meet all of the scientists there and all of the other people who were helping to make the Summit Station work. And then we came back.
In the sixth and concluding chapter, join our team as they leave their science outpost for the final time to explore the tundra's expanse and try to locate the original base camp from the first mission so long ago. What will be found? Will they find the camp at all? Follow along the winding fjords of Greenland, the new North Pole of the winds.
So we were winding down on our time here in Greenland, but we still had one objective that we had to get done, and it was to actually find Mount Evans, where Hobbs took his initial group.
The Hobbs Camp experience, I'll be honest, was probably the least exciting part of the trip. It's a long hike to get out to the site, and it's located on top of a mountain. It took a long time to find the site, and it took a long time to get there. Well, we had a vague idea where Mount Evans was.
We had multiple maps, and each map showed Mount Evans in a different spot.
The mountain was mislabeled.
And the two sets of GPS coordinates we had both differed by quite a great deal. We were kind of on our own, and it was a little bit of a wild goose chase. But to begin that hike, we first had to drive to the end of one of the only roads leading out of Kangerlussuaq. That place used to be called Kellyville.
So we eventually made it to Kellyville, and we decided, all right, we want to take a radiosonde measurement while we were actually at Mount Evans. And so, of course, we needed to fill up the balloon at Kellyville and then hike with it so that we wouldn't have to carry this 200-pound helium tank with us.
Recreating the Hobbs mission was really interesting because we really got to see firsthand how difficult it was to have field research in the time where they went on their expedition.
The Hobbs expedition predated helium tanks, so they had the unenviable task of creating their own gas on site by dropping pieces of calcium hydride into water, which then made hydrogen their gas of choice.
So hiking with the balloon took a little bit of time. Of course, I lost the use of my hands while I was hiking, which was pretty difficult, but it was really useful to actually keep track of where people were relative to the balloon, and we were radioing each other like, oh yeah, I'm inside of it, so we're okay.
And this walk is across a beautiful tundra of wildflowers and called wetlands. And then we'd be off in several directions, each of us trying to find this site until one of us actually located the site.
I think I found something. Hobbs Camp in sight. Follow Mark's coordinates. Hobbs Camp found. Can you confirm that you found the site? I certainly can. I certainly can. Wow. Amazing.
So we finally made it to just about the summit. We were seeing like the people up on top. We were just hiking up there. And then a nice big gust of wind caught my balloon and crunched it right into the ground, hitting the sharp stone and absolutely popping it. And I have not been more devastated in my entire time at Greenland.
I've got some good news and bad news.
Hope the good news is the balloon is gone.
The good news is we just saved $200. The bad news is it's a little gusty up here and the rocks are a little sharp.
Oh, all right. Let's launch.
All right.
Nonetheless, we were able to take drones and map the area and bring these measurements back so that we can show others what the site is like. There are obviously remnants of the site. There's a stone wall where the original housing was. They didn't have electricity up there, so much of their equipment was run on batteries.
Coming up upon the site, it was obviously very, very clear that somebody had done scientific work there because they had left old batteries and aluminum and lots of old metals. And I know that back in like 1926, that wasn't as big of a thing, but I feel like we tried really hard to practice leave no trace on our trip, so I'm glad that we got to leave a little bit of a different legacy than they did. We had heard small rumors that there might be some wild Arctic blueberries growing during the period while we were there, and we were hiking for many, many miles. We finally came across some wild blueberries.
Sean and I would be grabbing at blueberries and trying to just get a bunch and put them in a bag, and then we would sprint to catch up to everyone else who was hiking. Then we would stop again because we would find another patch and grab a bunch more and then sprint, and it was probably the most tired I've ever been when we got back to the cars.
For dinner that night, we all helped to make a cheesecake. Chelsea was the one who kind of spearheaded that, but it was really cool to be able to like collect them and then bring them back, and everybody got to share. It was really nice. It was the end of an incredible adventure, and we had a really long plane ride ahead of us. But I was really sad to actually leave Greenland.
This program was, I think, a success by any measure. First of all, the expedition was just a joy. I mean, I sort of felt like the students took me instead of the other way around, because their energy and their enthusiasm was so powerful.
So one of the strengths of our campaign, I think, is that we had students coming from 3 different universities working together. The students had never met each other. We all came together with these different expertise, which is how science works. That's how it's supposed to work, is that not everyone knows the exact same things. And so people could find the little thing that they felt like they were most comfortable on and then be challenged to work on problems and fields that maybe they hadn't been exposed to in their classwork.
One of my favorite parts is also just being able to experience sort of like what field research is like, what the challenges are, and appreciate how difficult it is to do field research, but to also discover that like it can be so much fun.
There needs to be trial and error at the beginning of anything that you're learning how to do. And so I think having these experiences when researchers are young and learning and developing their skill set is invaluable to the work that they can accomplish later, now knowing everything they know from messing up a few times.
Our entire purpose is just to be like a data point, I suppose. Something for future groups to kind of go and look back on and see how things are changing. Being like effectively the first data point in a long series of hopefully data points.
I made a lot of amazing friends on the trip and got to connect with really incredible professors and faculty that are doing amazing work. It's nice to interact with faculty outside of a classroom environment, being able to see someone as being more experienced than you, but yet still having the same passions, and they're sleeping in a tent and you're going on the same hikes, and allowed me to connect with professors in a way that I have never been able to before.
Yeah, I do feel changed from this trip. I feel maybe a little more confident in my abilities to do that kind of field work. That's not something that I've ever had to deal with before.
I definitely feel changed by this trip. I feel a whole lot more inspired. Also sort of nailed down my field sort of roughly for my PhD now, so definitely interested in studying glaciology.
I do feel changed by this trip. I feel like I had a passion for climate science before, but now I have experience in field work with climate science, and I also feel like I have a much greater passion to move forward and center climate change in my career.
A phenomenon that happens to astronauts when they finally go up into space and they see the whole world, and they kind of are like taking it in perspective and see how small they are in perspective to the world. And not that I'm saying that I've had that experience, but it seems kind of similar, like how small we are compared to the planet and how much we should be like working to try and preserve it.
And I guess as the last thing, do you think you'll be going back?
Oh, I sure hope so. I'm applying for a fellowship to go back right now, so we'll see how that goes.